All right, everybody, welcome back to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. We have talked, we don't talk about it all the time, but one of the things that we have talked about on the show over the course of the now almost 6 years that we have been on the air is highly selective admissions, and we talk a lot about distinguishing excellence. And one, we got a question from a parent who asked, could you talk a little bit more about some actual students who have distinguishing excellence and what those look like? And I thought it was a great idea because sometimes, it's hard to understand what that really is and without an illustration. And so I'm excited to welcome my colleague, Amy Alexander. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Beth. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Amy's a former admissions officer at Yale, and both Amy and I and all of members of our team have worked with students who are applying to highly selective schools. We work with lots of students applying to all kinds of schools. But Amy reached out to our team to kind of get a sense for, hey, what are some great examples, right, of students that we've worked with recently who have been successful and gotten into and enrolled in some Ivies. So I guess, if you had, before we dive into the examples, if you had some characteristics that you see stand out in the students, that when you get a new student and they have these things, you think, okay, we're on to something here. I think this might be a student who's going to be successful. What are those traits that you see?
That's a great question. And really, when we share, I got some great examples from the team, and I thought, wow, this is going to be a helpful podcast because so many students think, oh, it's test optional this year. I'll just apply. I might have a better
Right.
shot. It's not about that when you're looking at an Ivy or a highly selective school. So for me, when I think about those kids that get into those schools over and over again, they have the distinguishing excellence, which means they excel at something, right? And we're going to share examples of some specific things. But for me, it's not just one thing. It's usually two or three.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, like you have someone who's an athlete or someone who's in musical theater, or someone who's a speech and debate or a science Olympiad, or they usually also have something else. And it's not just that one thing. And there are few students, when really push comes to shove, that have that. And those are the ones that tend to get in. The other thing I repeatedly see, that it is natural and easeful. These students just come at this because they do it. Either they're really good at their extracurricular activity, like an academic team or a sport or theater or singing or whatever. But it's not forced. It's not strategized. It's not like, oh, let me come up with this. It just naturally evolves. And they are the type of students that are motivated, self-initiative. They dive into things. They want to engage at a really high and deep level.
Right.
And then the last thing is what I think is a huge characteristic is these students are resilient. You have a lot of kids out there that might make a mistake or might fail at something. They'll only stick with things that are comfortable or that they're pretty good at. These kids embrace failing. These kids make mistakes and it fuels them even more. It actually drives them even more and makes them that much more successful. So they're really interesting and very rare kids. And that's why you have that less than 10% that kind of get in. When people say, well, I don't get it. My son or daughter has the grades, the scores, they were the best in the class. Well, you don't know about all these other things, which are huge in this pool.
Right, exactly. And, I think, to be fair, it's not that these students don't necessarily get guidance or
Yes.
someone who can kind of point them in the right direction. It's more than anything, something that the student wants and not that the parent wants for the student, right? I think that's such an important part of this. But
Yeah, student driven is definitely, and I couldn't agree more. It really, as I said, it's not forced. The parent didn't strategize with someone, and people are guiding and helping. I work with students every day and help them with their resume to format it so it presents their best self, is easy to read for an admissions officer. A lot of these kids have resumes that go on for pages. And I say, having worked at the Yale admissions office, I'm not going to read past like 2 or 3, like half a page. I'm not going to read it. And you have
Mhm.
good stuff on page 3. So let's condense it. I do work with these students, but it's the drive and the initiative and everything comes from them.
Right, exactly. Okay, so let's share some examples. You
Okay.
had a great example of a student who is either currently enrolled in Brown or got into Brown. So what
Mhm.
did this student bring to the table?
So this is a great one. She is an accomplished pianist. She won many state and national level competitions, which is tough, as we know in music.
Hmm.
But again, here's that second DE or distinguishing excellence, third place in the Massachusetts State Science Fair. Third place, right?
Hmm.
She's also leader and president of her robotics club. She ran a virtual summer camp and teaches kids to code all throughout the year.
Right. Yeah.
That's multiple.
Yep. She's got a lot of things going on. And none of these things, in my opinion, are crazy unattainable things. I have a couple of examples that might feel a little like, wow, that's never going to happen. But they're attainable. But at the same time, it did require that the student be really engaged, really involved, and really motivated to do the things that she did. So I have a student I worked with a couple of years ago who is at Harvard, but also got into Stanford. And like you were just pointing out, had two pretty big deal things. So one, he was a national champion in debate.
Mhm.
So obviously going beyond even his state level, he was literally the national champion. And then in addition to that, he was also an entrepreneur. So he had created a tutoring program that he sold to some school districts in his state and also in another state. And then he secured himself a summer internship at a venture capital firm to both learn about that world a little bit more, but also to get some assistance in developing his idea a little bit further. So he had those two really big things. And there's no doubt that those really helped when it came to getting into those schools.
Yeah, and you raise a really good point, and we're bringing up examples, and I wanted to bring up examples that I thought were a little more attainable.
Mhm.
They are multiple things, and not every student could do this at this level. I have one girl who got into Harvard, and I'll share about her in a minute, but um, these things really a lot of people can do, right?
Right.
But in the past, I have a young man who got into Stanford a handful of years ago, and he was a computer programmer, and he had sold one of his programs for $350,000 in high
Wow.
school. That's one of those things that you're not going to find many kids doing that,
Right.
right?
Right.
I had another kid who also got into Stanford. I just happened to be bringing up Stanford, but was one of the top lacrosse players in the country and a national top 10 debater.
Right.
All right, you got the athlete and the academic in the debate. Those are not common.
Right.
Having that level of skill in athletics, not everyone can just do that. You could be on a lacrosse team. So, yeah, I agree. And then there's one other girl who ended up going to Harvard, but also got into Stanford. She was a published author in high school
Yeah.
and already had a book out. Those are ones that are a little more clear. The ones I wanted to bring up are things I think a lot of you listeners, your students maybe could do.
Mhm.
But so that you understand, there are students that get into these schools that have attainable, DEs.
Right, exactly, exactly, and what that looks like.
Yeah.
So speaking of, you had another young woman who was accepted to Princeton, so let's hear a
Yeah.
little bit about her.
Yeah, she's a really neat one. National award-winning soprano singer, plus huge, huge, huge involvement in community service. She was the founder of a nonprofit connecting high schoolers to World War II vets, which stemmed from her Girl Scout her Gold Award. She won a congressional award for this honor, recognized by the Daughters of American Revolution and the Girl Scouts of America. That's a
Yep,
big one.
yep,
That's a big one.
yeah,
Two
huge.
big ones. Two big ones.
Two very big ones. Alongside another student that we worked with who he was admitted to both Princeton and Penn, opted to go to Penn. He went to a joint degree program at Penn that is between Wharton and the College of Arts and Sciences. And the goal is really to graduate students who the group feels will be global leaders eventually. And he
Mhm.
was um, an American citizen who grew up in Hong Kong. He was a major leader at his school in Hong Kong, president of the class, and it was a very big school. And for an American student to be president of the class, kind of a big deal. Was a pretty talented athlete, but not at the level where you would be recruited. But he was actually a global traveler, and not because his family was wealthy, but because he qualified for this very unique program along with about 6 other kids. And they literally traveled in this huge section of the globe, but like, hiking through it, and not the easy kind, not like take a plane here and land and do a tour and then you take a plane here. It was kind of like living off the land, traveling. And he was also fluent in Chinese and had spent 2 summers in rural China, taking a course at one of the biggest universities in China, but then also going into rural China and teaching English to some of the Chinese students who were there. Too many things actually for me to mention, but
Yeah.
in and of themselves, each one of them was kind of interesting and unique, but because he had all of them, it was
Mhm.
really, that's, I think, what really made that particularly impressive, was the number of things that he had managed to accomplish.
And
But
that is, and we're seeing now with these examples over and over again. When I sat in committee, and you probably as well, Beth,
mhm,
you'd hear these wonderful stories, or you'd see the interesting things they did. But it was these kids that got the discussion. And it wasn't, the one who, sold a computer program for 350,000. That was pretty, and his grades were perfect and perfect SATs. That was easy. But the other ones, these are the ones we repeatedly talk about, because these are the ones where these kids are not just doing one, they're doing multiple things.
well, and here's the other interesting thing. So my student we just talked about, who got into Princeton and into this very difficult to get into program at Penn, it's the Huntsman program, couldn't come up with a name a minute ago,
Yeah, great.
did not get in to Harvard or to Stanford, which were 2 other schools that he really was interested in. So I personally looked at his application and said, he is going to waltz in everywhere, but he did not get into those
Mhm.
2 schools. And I think that points out something else, which is he was unique and impressive and compelling in the pools at Penn and Princeton in a way that he was not at Stanford and at
Mhm.
Harvard. I'm quite sure that they had conversations about him. I'm sure there were champions who were hoping to get him in the class at those schools because he was really impressive. But they had other choices and they made different choices. And that's another kind of wrinkle to the whole thing, is when you've got all of these incredibly talented students in different applicant pools, the decisions are not going to be the same at every school. And for him, they were not.
And that's a really, really salient point, Beth, because it's showing you can have these kids that are standouts, that have 2, 3, 4 DEs, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm.
strong grades and all of that. It's not about that. And what, you listeners need to understand with these kinds of universities, it's building a class.
Yeah.
So just because someone has all of those, they are wonderful, and they probably will land at one of these, a
Mhm.
selective college, if you will. But they're building a class from students all over the world. So that doesn't always get you in everywhere.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So hard to say, but true. Okay. You have another Harvard example. So tell us about this student.
Yeah, this was one of my students this past year, and I just adored her. I mean, after we got off a session, I was exhausted. She had so much energy, but positive energy. This young woman started and registered a nonprofit organization serving the Virginia, where she lived, Virginia and Washington, D.C. community in middle school. She
Mm,
started on her own. Her parents gave her some guidance, but she did it. It
mm,
was all her, and she kept going all the way through high school. She fundraised for 30 scholarships for students in underserved areas in India. She organized and packed over 25,000 meals through Kids
wow.
Against Hunger. She organized a huge cyber bullies seminar. She put together a health and wellness fair. She coordinated and got up and spoke in front of hundreds of people at a rally to protest inhumane family separation policies. She's president for Student Diversity Board and the International UN Organization Foundation Chapter. Also founder and captain at her school of speech and debate, published articles, winner of essay competitions and speaking competitions.
Right, right. One thing we haven't really commented on, but I actually do think, we have mentioned, and this is another example of students excelling in a few different ways, but they're all sort of tied together, So here
Mhm.
we see a student who's clearly a persuasive speaker, right?
Mhm.
She's comfortable speaking to people. She is a good writer. She writes and does that well. And I have no doubt, used those skills to serve the underserved. So, and a lot of the work that she did on that side was about underserved students. So
Mhm.
thematically, it holds together. It's not like she did two incredibly disparate things really well and they had no link between them. They were all of a piece. And my student who was the national debate champion and also an entrepreneur, same thing, right? He was
Mhm.
really great speaker and he could bring people into his vision and help them see it. And that is what helped him to sell this tutoring program into these school districts. So they do go together, even if maybe it's not super clear. One of the things we work with students on is kind of figuring that piece out too, is how do you present this in a way so that they see your strengths, they see your accomplishments, and they also see how they kind of come together.
Yeah.
So
And some of the other qualities, in talking about this is maturity, confidence, unafraid to take risks, putting yourself out there,
right,
again, that failure, resiliency. And a lot of these, not all, but the majority of students have some compassion toward others. And it could be working with the underserved, or it could be tutoring, other
mhm,
students. It could be just in the classroom. If we were to dive into, and we're not talking about this today, the recommendation letters, you'd often hear this kid is often finished first and is helping the kid next to him, is
right.
provoking discussion and guiding people into the discussion. That's the kind of kid that we're
Right,
talking about.
exactly. And it is not, because please don't walk away thinking, oh, it's all about community service, because I
Right.
promise
No.
you, it's not.
No.
This is the myth that will not die, that you must have community service and that that's what it is, because that is not the holy grail. It is more just that you have something you're excited about and you are figuring out ways to use that excitement positively. We have a colleague who talks about how, they're looking for students who are going to change the world in
Mhm.
whatever way that is, right? But and more, probably more to the point, they've already taken steps to make that happen.
Yep.
Right? You can
In
want,
the small community or in
yep.
the broader, really what you said, no matter where, but in some, could be school community, could be a larger, whatever,
Right.
but yeah.
Could be done in a science lab, could be,
Mhm.
I mean, I read it, I remember, this is already going back a long time, but when I was working at Penn, we had a student who applied who had received a scholarship from the Nobel Committee. Like, not kidding. He had gotten a
Mhm.
$60,000 scholarship from Nobel based on some work that he'd done in a lab. Again, it's an extreme example,
Right.
but these are the kinds of things that some of these students are doing. It is daunting to listen to this and think,
Yeah.
wow, I think our hope here is not to scare people. I think the idea is just to understand how it is that this great student, either that's in your home or that you know of in your school community, who is a really good kid and does a couple of things in school and is really beloved, does well in class and does well when there is standardized testing on their standardized tests, and yet doesn't get into any of the highly selective schools. And the reason for that is because it just goes so far beyond that, and that's what
Mhm.
these examples are designed to show. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
So welcome. Great to be here.
Absolutely. And for anyone who's interested in, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we blog about every podcast that we do. And so if you're curious, hey, when have they talked about distinguishing excellence in the past? When have they talked about Ivy League admissions in the past? Or when have we talked about the whole getting in-state tuition in the past? If you go to our blog, if you search for those pieces, and we did a podcast on it, it will come up and it will tell you what the date was. And then you can go to Voice America and listen to the show. All right, very quickly. Next week, Sally is hosting. We're talking about affirmative action and admissions and helping you understand what that really is all about. We have ideas for students applying with late applications or at this point in the process, and also how to review your financial aid award letters. And we're also here every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Pacific.